few days ago, we discussed dependent origination, which we understand as the causes and conditions for how suffering arises. But that's just one part of the game. In order to complete the game, you need to know how to get to liberation from suffering. And that's why we will be discussing what is commonly known as the transcendental links of dependent origination. These are the links that take you to liberation of the mind. And what does it start with? Here, according to this chart that we have, there are 11 links. But before we get to the first link here, which is faith, we have to understand what faith is dependent upon. Faith actually is dependent upon suffering. You won't come to a path or any path that looks for a way out of suffering unless you've had enough of suffering. If you haven't had enough suffering and you haven't had enough disenchantment about that suffering, then you will not find a way out. The Buddha has explained that there are two ways that suffering leads to. One is further confusion, which means when you have an experience of suffering, what do? You try to numb it with sex, drugs, and alcohol. You You try to numb that suffering by using sensual pleasures. And what that does is that leads to further suffering. And so you're just in this continuous cycle of suffering and numbing that pain of suffering. Or there is another way out in which the Buddha says that one has the question, is there a way out of suffering? And is there someone who knows a word or two, as it's mentioned in the suttas, about the way out of this suffering? And so the quest begins. The search out of suffering begins. The algorithm that takes you to Dhamma Sukha begins. Right? You search for meditation, or you search for Brahma Viharas. You search for something, and because you heard about this place, or you heard about Bhante Vimarahamsi, or you heard about TWIM, or you heard about Buddhism, or somebody told you about it. And you say, maybe this is an interesting thing I should check out. And so you do. And so that is the beginning of faith, because you are willing to see for yourself and try it out and see if this process actually works. Now, when we talk about faith, when we talk about saddha or shraddha, we're talking about the willingness and openness to try something and be able to see it through to the end. That's the first level of faith. But in tandem to that faith, which is not mentioned here, but it is mentioned in other suttas, like in Anguttara Nikaya 10.1 to 10.5, they talk about the 10 links that take you out of suffering and lead to liberation. And that first link, in tandem with faith, is virtue. What is virtue? Having virtuous thoughts, virtuous speech, and virtuous actions. In other words, you start off with right view, which is starting with that faith of saying, okay, let me see what this is all about. and then understanding what is wholesome and unwholesome, and then making the effort to take you from the unwholesome to the wholesome. And you start taking the precepts. That is virtuous behavior, which leads to right intention, to let go of clinging to the I, me, myself, to let go of ill will and cruelty by practicing the Brahma Viharas. And then you have right speech and right action. And those are upholding the 5 basic precepts. While you're on retreat, you have 8, but when you get off of retreat, you make a commitment to keep those precepts all the time. Because then you start to see for yourself how this process works. You start to see that when you keep the precepts, your mind starts to become clearer. And when your mind starts to get clearer, you experience the next link, which is gladness, pamoja. So when we talk about gladness, what does that mean? It says here, now you have found the Dhamma and find it is working, and it makes you happy to study and meditate. You experience your first relief from the hindrances. You start to see how when you keep the precepts, when you take the refuges, keep the precepts, that your mind starts to become freer and freer of hindrances. And so that relief of no more hindrances in the mind and that commitment to keep the precepts gladdens the mind. It brings a certain level of upliftment to the mind. So from that willingness to try this practice, you then cultivate the effort to keep the practice going, first and foremost through the precepts and then through meditating. So when you sit down to meditate, you may have to deal with more hindrances. They might be more coarse than they were before, and you might have things that you need to let go of. You might not right away feel that gladness. You may not right away feel that joy. So what do? Sometimes I will prescribe forgiveness as a means of letting go coarser hindrances that are just lodged in the mind and in the heart. And so you do that and you experience even greater amounts of relief. Not everybody has to do it. Some people don't need it, and so they experience some feeling of joy right away. And so the joy that they feel in tandem to keeping the mind free of hindrances is the first jhana. So that link of joy, the joy that arises from finding the path, that is a quality of the first jhana, the first and second jhana. So what does that joy feel like? Everybody knows what joy feels like, right? The joy that you feel from sensual pleasures is what? It's just a certain level of excitement in the mind and in the body. But now you are experiencing a different kind of joy that is not tied to the 5 physical senses. Now you are experiencing a level of joy that is cultivated from and through and in the mind. Such joy, being independent of the physical senses, is repeatable. Such joy is always accessible. That in itself is a wonderful thing. The fact that you don't need things around you. You don't need, it's not the objects that make you happy. The happiness arises because it is the nature of your mind when it is free of hindrances. These hindrances are like coverings. They cover up the luminosity of the mind. They cover up the clarity of the mind. And because the hindrances are continuously there all throughout your life, beings believe that this is just the nature of their mind, that the nature of their mind is helter-skelter, that the nature of their mind is always, being a bully or an enemy or a frenemy. Sometimes it's a friend and sometimes it's an enemy. Sometimes it likes you, sometimes it doesn't like you. And sometimes you like it and sometimes you don't like it. And people go around throughout their lives feeling this way. But the only reason is because there are all of these different coverings, different kinds of dust in the form of the hindrances and defilements of the mind. And so when you first experience this freedom from hindrances and letting go, using right effort, using the 6 R's, you start to feel a certain level of joy. Sometimes it can be a great amount of joy that people will start to have tears rolling down their cheeks because it's so good. It feels amazing, and there's so much relief in that. And subsequently, as your mind starts to get used to that joy, it might not feel as great as it was the first time, but it still feels good. And there's a certain level of comfort in knowing that that joy is always accessible every time you let go of hindrances. So when you experience that joy in the first and the second jhana, eventually that joy passes away because that joy ultimately is impermanent. All experience that is there in the mind is conditioned. And being conditioned, it is subject to change. It is subject to passing away. So that joy gives rise to or makes way for tranquility. So that experience of tranquility that you feel is in the third jhana. This is the tranquility that arises as a result of meditation and following the precepts and being generous. What does it mean to be generous? It means to be generous with your time, generous with your resources, generous with your smile, generous with your efforts, generous with your teachings if you're a teacher. That in itself brings such level of clarity and peace to the mind that you experience tranquility. So you started off with suffering, and then that led to faith to see how this process works, the openness and willingness to try this out. Then making the proper effort to do so, you start to experience gladness, that you feel uplifted by this. And then when your mind experiences relief from the 5 hindrances, you experience joy of the first jhana. And that gives rise then to tranquility, where the mind feels very much at ease, very balanced, very content. And then tied to that contentment, you experience the happiness, the Sukha. And this is a signature of the third jhana, the tranquility and the Sukha, the happiness. What is that happiness? It is a relaxed, content, comfortable feeling in the body and in the mind. Your body becomes stable, stops moving around from place to place. It feels very still, very balanced. And so that's why in the third jhana, you experience a lightness to the body, or you experience a certain level of depth and steadiness in the body. Regardless of what you feel, these are sure signs that the mind is experiencing sukha. And then from that sukha, you get into collectedness, samadhi. At this point, you have experienced the first, second, third, and now starting to experience the fourth jhana. So in the fourth jhana, you have purity of mindfulness due to equanimity. Absolute, pristine clarity of awareness. And so this collectedness allows you to see things as they actually are. That's the next step. The knowledge and vision of things as they actually are. So from the fourth jhana, your mind is able to just notice things as they are. What does that mean? It means now you have developed equanimity. And so by this point, you have also experienced or developed all of the enlightenment factors, the factors of awakening. What are the factors of awakening? Mindfulness, investigation of states, energy, joy, tranquility, collectedness, and equanimity. So mindfulness, you become more mindful. You start to become more present to things in your mind, and you have greater clarity of the things that you're doing from moment to moment. When you take the commitment or make the commitment to come on retreat, you naturally become more aware of things as they are. Right now you have developed a certain level of mindfulness. That mindfulness then leads to investigation of states. What are those investigation? What is the investigation of states? It essentially means that your mind experiences right view. Because then you start to notice what is wholesome and unwholesome. That is the most basic right view that is dependent upon this faith. Because you have that right view, you don't have any doubts. And then from there, you make the right effort to let go. Let go of the unwholesome states of mind. Because in order for you to let go of unwholesome states of mind, you need to know what is wholesome and what is unwholesome, dependent upon the investigation of states. So from that energy, there is gladness, right? The relief from the hindrances. Then from that energy arises piti, the joy of the first jhana. And from that joy, there is tranquility. So that tranquility is relaxing tightness and tension in the mind and body. From that tranquility, then there is collectedness. So there you experience collectedness at samadhi in the fourth jhana, the culmination of samadhi, of collectedness. Then from there you experience equanimity. And that equanimity is yata bhuta jnana darshanam, the knowledge and vision of things as they actually are. Which means that quality of your mind that is able to perceive. Now mind is experiencing infinite space. Now mind is experiencing infinite consciousness. Now mind is in nothingness. Now mind is in quiet mind. Now mind is experiencing still mind. Now mind is experiencing the arising and passing away of formations. All of this is equanimity. Because what is equanimity? When we talk about equanimity, it is the ability to see things as they actually are without getting affected one way or the other. If it's a joyful feeling, your mind doesn't gravitate to it just because it's joyful. If it's a unpleasant feeling, your mind doesn't push it away just because it's unpleasant. And if it's a neutral feeling, your mind doesn't ignore it and have indifference to it just because it's neutral. Your mind has total balance and equanimity. So at this point, you're experiencing equanimity at the level of nothingness. And then that transitions into, after radiating equanimity for some time, it leads to the mind getting quieter and settling in on itself. Once the mind settles in on itself, then it goes through a process of sinking into neither perception nor non-perception, or neither recognition nor non-recognition. That hazy, dream-like space where you notice certain formations coming up and unable to make sense of it. That alert but hypnagogic state that's there. And as your mind starts to develop stronger amounts of equanimity, it sinks even lower, and now it comes to quiet mind. There's some vibrations there. It's like at that point, that quiet mind is in the eye of the hurricane, right? It's there, and there's stuff around it in the periphery. Thoughts come up, images come up, different kinds of formations come up. But the mind having that equanimity does not go in those directions. It doesn't deviate from its home base of mind itself, of that presence of mind, of that awareness of awareness. But if it does start to go in a certain direction, what do? At that point, all you have to do is relax and then return. Relax any formation that comes up and come back to quiet mind. From that quiet mind, then you experience what's known as still mind. In that still mind, there are no vibrations at all. And that meditator who's in still mind can be in that stillness for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, where absolutely nothing is going on. Not a single movement of mind. But before that can happen, there's a tendency for the mind to want to do something, right? Nothing is going on. Maybe I should bring up a little bit of joy. Maybe I need to bring up more equanimity. Maybe I should do that. No. At that point, when you are in quiet mind, when the mind settles in on itself, there's absolutely nothing to do. Only when the mind deviates, you relax and you come back. You notice patterns in the mind, you notice distant memories, you notice shapes, you notice faces, you notice all kinds of vibrations in the mind. And the mind, because of lack of stimulation, wants to engage with those things, wants to observe what's going on over there. That's just fooling itself. The mind is fooling itself. There's a wonderful movie called Little Buddha. And there's a scene in there where the Bodhisattva is sitting under the Bodhi tree. And he's in deep meditation. And at this point, the armies of Mara come charging at him. Right? And these are all of the formations, the shapes, the patterns, the pictures, the memories, the faces, they're all being launched at him. 100,000 arrows all being shot at him at once. And what does he do? He does nothing. He just sits there. And in the movie, you see this sort of force field around him. And that's just this equanimity that he has. And whatever arrow starts to go past that force field towards him, what happens? Each arrow turns into a flower that gently floats down. In the same way, when you don't engage with these formations, all of those things just dissipate. And there's a sense of relief, a sense of release from all of that. And you don't have to do anything. Not only is your body as still as him, but so is your mind. Absolutely still. Absolutely non-reactive. Non-judgmental. Uninclined. And because the attention is not being given to any of those arrows in the periphery, they turn into flowers of release and relief and joy and happiness. And they last for maybe a few microseconds. And at this point, as you're in there, your mind starts to drop even deeper. Some people feel like they're getting into this space where the mind feels like it's falling asleep. Like it's like your head even nods. But it's not the same as sloth and torpor. In sloth and torpor, your mind feels dull and heavy and groggy, like there's molasses in your head. But this, what you experience where the head bobs a little bit and the mind just zones into something and comes out, there's a wonderful luster to the mind. There's a radiance and luminosity to the mind, a lightness to the mind, a little bit of relief that's there. So if this happens, don't worry. Let the mind keep going deeper. Just observe. Don't do anything. Just be there and don't do anything. Just allow things to happen. Don't try to make things happen. Allow them to happen on their own. The allowing of this to happen is equanimity. And then at a certain point, if it hasn't already happened at this point, the mind experiences what's known as disenchantment. So what does that mean, disenchantment? First of all, enchantment. What does that mean, enchantment? Enchantment means you get pulled into the directions of those formations. Your mind wants to observe and analyze and investigate and engage with those pictures, patterns, shapes, memories, faces, whatever it might be. And if you notice the mind doing this, what do you do in that moment? Relax and return. But at a certain point, your mind still remains enchanted. That means you haven't gotten enough equanimity. Because the next step from knowledge and vision of things as they are, which is really equanimity, is the disenchantment. Here it says one has had enough of the constant arising and passing away of phenomenon. And that becomes laborious and just too much to bear anymore. That's what I mean. You haven't suffered enough. Your mind hasn't suffered enough. Because if it did suffer enough, it would say, okay, this is enough. It's the same thing over and over again. All of these formations that are coming up, it's just going to happen whether I want it or not. So I'm going to just let it be and not pay attention to that anymore. Let it just be in the periphery. And as that happens, it starts to become less and less active. But if you notice that the mind starts to go back to it, starts to get pulled in that direction, what do? This is why I have told you, you cycle back to equanimity. Go back to radiating equanimity again for a little while, because you have not developed enough equanimity, enough knowledge and vision of things as they actually are for the disenchantment to arise as a fruit of that equanimity. So then when you send out that equanimity, after a little while, your mind becomes quiet again. And you go through that same process. But maybe this time around, you do have that disenchantment and you are tired of the same old stuff coming up. And if you aren't, and your mind still engages it, what do? Go back to equanimity. You can't bring up the equanimity, what do you bring up instead? What is that equanimity dependent upon? Collectedness. It means you don't have enough collectedness. How do you develop that collectedness? Bring up some other Brahmavihara again. Bring up some loving kindness. Bring up some joy. Bring up some compassion. And let it transition into equanimity. If that's not happening, what do? You don't have enough stability in the mind. You don't have enough comfort in the mind. There's too much pain and aches going on, either mentally or physically. What does that mean? You don't have enough relaxation. You don't have enough tranquility. So this process that you're seeing is a map for you to see how to deal with whatever is going on. You don't have enough equanimity? Bring up more collectedness. Develop more Brahmaviharas. There's not enough collectedness because there's not enough stability in the mind. How do you have stability? Bring in more relaxation. There's not enough relaxation or tranquility. That means your mind is having a lot of hindrances. How do you let go of those hindrances? 6R. Everything works in this way. One thing leads to the other. If there is something missing, you go back to the preceding link and see if it's there. Or if it's not there, or if there's not enough of that, develop it fully until it spills over into the next link, naturally. And then develop that fully until it spills over to the next link, naturally, and so on. So let's say now you have developed enough equanimity where you're radiating equanimity in all directions and it feels wonderful and the mind is utterly quiet and it bypasses all neither perception and non-perception, goes into quietness and stillness. And now your mind has disenchantment. It doesn't care what's going on. And then at that point, the mind then goes into dispassion. So what does dispassion here say? Phenomena keep rolling on, but you understand there's nothing to do or to be done except to just let go and observe. As you start to get into this dispassion, the mind becomes like Teflon. Whatever comes up just passes through the mind or is deflected on its own. And at this point, you get into what's known as the signless collectedness of mind, objectless awareness of mind. At this point, doing anything is too tense. And so in just the seeing of something come up, it rests. You don't have to do anything. It happens automatically. Trying to do anything else, trying to relax, trying to let go, disengages you from that quietness. And now you come back into dealing with formations, dealing with activity, and now you have to go back to equanimity again. If not equanimity, go back to joy. If not joy, go back to compassion. If not compassion, go back to loving kindness. If not radiating loving kindness, go back to bringing up loving kindness to yourself, because it's through that you have gladness, you have joy, you have tranquility, and you have happiness. So then when you have this dispassion, eventually the mind becoming so still just drops. And it can happen for a split second. It's different from those moments where your mind just flickers out for a moment and you find yourself catching yourself going up like this again. Those are called, or what I call, micro cessations. Your mind is inching closer and closer towards letting go at deeper and deeper levels. And the moment you notice that you're anticipating something happening, and the moment you notice that you want something to happen, that means now you have to develop a disenchantment again. How do you develop that disenchantment? Radiate equanimity. When you radiate equanimity, your disenchantment arises as the fruition of that equanimity that goes into dispassion, and again, you're there. This time, there's no anticipation. This time, there's no wanting or waiting for something. The mind is fully okay with whatever happens. And when you least expect it, the mind just drops. And that is liberation, the cessation of all phenomena. The cessation of all perception, feeling, and consciousness. At this point, the mind can touch the unconditioned. That is Nibbana, the Nibbana dhatu. When the mind touches the Nibbana dhatu, as a result of that, it then experiences great amounts of joy and relief. And so in the suttas, it's talked about the undirected, the signless, and the empty or void contact, the touch with that which is empty of any self, which is signless because it's not an object, and which is undirected because there is absolutely no craving or desire in it at all. That in itself is the unconditioned. Whenever you relax and let go, your mind experiences mundane Nibbana. That's relief. And in this Nibbana dhatu, the supramundane Nibbana that arises or happens, it's just there. You don't have to do anything. Just allow things to be as they are, and 6R whenever your mind gets disturbed one way or the other. And come back. And eventually, when the conditions are ripe, the mind drops and touches Nibbana. And when it touches Nibbana, that contact that is undirected, signless, and empty, it then experiences the feeling of joy and relief, which in itself is conditioned by the unconditioned, contact with the unconditioned. When you experience that joy and relief, then you notice that the mind says, what was that? And there's some kind of seeing that you experience, some kind of vision that you experience. Maybe you see whatever it is you see. Some people, this is a mental model of how dependent origination arises. You notice the feeling, you notice the perception, you notice the contact. You notice all of this in some way or the other. Some people see links, some people see wheels, some people see dots, some people see dashes. Whatever it is you see, it doesn't matter. Don't look for it. It will come of its own accord. When it arises, when it happens, your mind experiences tremendous relief. And then at that point, in that moment, that mind is absolutely free. For that moment, the mind actually experiences arhatship. Because there is absolutely No craving, no ignorance, no conceit, no wrong views there. But because the mind says, that was amazing, because there's no stability in that, as the Buddha says in Majjhima Nikaya 10, when he talks about the 4 foundations of mindfulness, he says, if one is not stable in it, then he goes to a lesser state. In this case, either anagami or sakadagami or sotapanna. If the mind is not stable in that, what does that mean? If the mind remains unaffected even by that joy and relief and doesn't cling to that as me, mine, or myself, then the mind experiences arhatship. Rare and difficult, but not impossible. But for the majority, what happens is the mind looks and sees that it experienced something. So that is where there's a review process, that something amazing happened. And then you come to the teacher or the guide and you report that to them and they say, okay, great, keep going. Rinse and repeat. What does that mean, rinse and repeat? You go back and you start from faith. You go back to gladness, joy, tranquility, happiness, collectedness, equanimity. You do the same thing again. And when you least expect it, it happens. This is what's very important for you guys to understand. If you anticipate it, it will not happen. But when you least expect it, the mind just drops. And let's say then the mind does experience full liberation. Let's say when mind makes contact with Nibbana, that there is just absolute pristine awareness of that. No clinging to this or that. Just observing things as they are. When that happens, the mind then looks back and sees that indeed all 3 asavas are destroyed. What does that mean? The asavas, the 3 taints, the 3 asavas. The taint of sensual desire, the taint for craving for existence, and the taint of ignorance. When the mind experiences becoming an anagami, it lets go of the taint of sensual desire. That means no more of the roots of any sensual desire can arise. And then when it attains arhatship, no more craving for existence or non-existence can arise. And because the mind is absolutely attentive, no more ignorance arises. Now the mind has completed what had to be done. That's why in the suttas it says, the mind is liberated. And when it is liberated, the mind knows it is liberated. What had to be done has been done. The holy life has been lived. There is no more birth. There is no coming to be in a new existence. And so that is the final phase, the destruction of the taints. All greed, all hatred, all delusion are destroyed. And how does this happen? There is a sutta, which is Samyutta Nikaya 12.23, the Upanisa Sutta. And in that sutta, it says, one observes the arising and passing away of form, the arising and passing away of feeling, the arising and passing away of perception, the arising and passing away of formations, and the arising and passing away of consciousness. In seeing that these 5 aggregates are dependently arisen, the mind lets go of any notion of it being, or of them being permanent. Lets go of any expectation of happiness from them and experiences anatta. Sees them as not me, not mine, not myself. And because of that, it completely drops everything. Having dropped, it then has the knowledge of the destruction of the taints. That is the reviewing phase. And that is when the mind has that statement in one way or the other, that it is liberated, birth is destroyed, etc., etc., etc. Until you get there, all you have to do is rinse and repeat. It's that simple. Don't complicate it. The reason why it feels complicated, the reason why the mind complicates it, is because it is so used to difficulty in life that it expects even this to be difficult. But the Buddha has said, there are different ways to experience this. There is the path that is difficult in the beginning and difficult in the end. There is the path that is difficult in the beginning and easy in the end. There is a path that is easy in the beginning and difficult in the end. And there is the path that is easy in the beginning and easy in the end. Which one would you choose? This is the path that is easy in the beginning and easy in the end. So I will just conclude with this last statement because this is so important to understand. It says here, just as monks, when rain descends heavily upon some mountaintop, the water flows down along with the slope and fills the clefts, gullies, and creeks. These being filled up, fill up the pools. These being filled up, fill up the ponds. These being filled up, fill up the streams. These being filled up, fill up the rivers. And the rivers being filled up, fill up the great ocean. It's natural. If you bring up one link in this transcendence or transcendental dependent origination, it will spill over to the next. And as that is fully developed, it spills over to the next and next and next. If you have just this map and follow it, it will take you all the way to the end. Any questions? Yeah, over there. Oh.
I was curious about the taints, greed, hatred, and delusion. So far, we've, in the creation of suffering, talked about ignorance and craving and aversion. Are those taints something separate than what we've talked about already, or?
They're like a virus that infects the mind or the software of the mind. So they keep compounding every time the mind indulges in craving, that is greed. Every time the mind has aversion, that is hatred. Every time the mind forgets to see things as they are, that is ignorance or delusion.
Is the clear, quiet mind, is that kind of underneath everything all the time, but there's just stuff happening so you don't see it?
That's right. This is known as the Pabhasara Chitta. If you read Anguttara Nikaya, the Book of Ones, the first few sutras talk about that, the luminous mind. The Buddha says, luminous is the mind, monks. That is the nature of the mind. But because of defilements, because of all of this stuff, the mind seems the way it seems. So in other words, what happens is you take those defilements and everything else for the mind rather than the clarity that is actually the mind.
get it, I think.
Okay, so I have a question, a couple of questions actually. So once like still mind has been reached, you mentioned you can stay there for a really long time, but is it like the next step is this cessation experience? Or is that not really the next step?
It can be.
Okay.
It can be.
And what determines whether that's going to be there or not?
If the mind doesn't hold on to anything.
Okay. Okay. My next question was that, is it necessary, like if it seems that the previous stages have been sort of completed in a way, to go back from like an earlier stage every meditation?
No.
Okay.
You just start from where you left off, and then you make adjustments accordingly.
Okay.
All the way in the back there.
I have 3 questions. The first one is, up until like dispassion, disenchantment, liberation, until you touch the nirvana dhatu, you say, don't fall into it, don't let the mind do this. Who is that's telling or not telling or control? Is that the Atmic's principle or life principle, or who is that's over the mind?
That is the mind itself. So the mind is watching mind. It's like you have the mind here, and then you have a mirror, which is the consciousness. And the mind reflects whatever is reflecting off of the mirror of consciousness is the image, is the object. So it seems like there's 2 things going on here. There's a mind and there's something above the mind. But in reality, it is all just different aspects of mind watching what's going on.
Does at any time in this journey, does the life want to leave the body? Like like people say they die, right? In that state.
No one is going to die here in this retreat.
No, I'm just
No, but that is called Mahasamadhi. And that happens when it's a more complex process where the mind, or let's say the meditator, lets go of the life principle. In other words, there's certain kinds of samskaras that tie the life to this body, the life energy to this body. But there are certain things, like the Buddha had done 3 months prior to his passing away, to his parinirvana. He let go of the life principle, and it unraveled in such a way that he attained that parinibbana. So that won't happen here in this process until the mind lets go of certain karmic residues that keep the life energies going in this body.
And the last question is, even people, who have attained nirvana, and there are descriptions, and some people who are alive and whatever, they still, do they bring emotions like anger or any of those just to get things done? They're not attached to it, but if they need something done, they may look angry.
So when somebody becomes fully liberated, there's no more seed of anger or greed or hatred or delusion coming up. But they can be stern. They can use what seems like harsh speech to get their point across, right? They can be stern, like, we talk about tough love, for example, but they won't get angry. It's not coming or motivated from some kind of irritation or aversion.
I mean, but all of those, they use it as a tool rather than really feeling it.
No.
Like if they need to get something done, or if somebody gives them some food, and at the moment they put in the tongue, they say it's nice, but then they're not attached to it. Is it like emotion used as?
So, okay, I see what you're saying here. So sometimes that mind that is free will experience things that are pleasant, and sometimes it will experience things that are unpleasant. And it will feel the pleasant quality of that, and it will say, oh, this is nice, and it will enjoy it. Or it will say, this doesn't feel good to me, or it just feels unpleasant. To that extent, there will be that, but there will be a level of detachment where there won't be any mental agitation around that.
This is in reference to the sutta last night, so we'll see how we do. There was one section that's talking about craving and aversion, and then neutral, so objects, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral feelings.
Right.
Okay. So pleasant, if there's craving for underlying tendency to craving,
Right.
not good. If there's underlying tendency towards aversion, problematic.
Right.
And then, but if you have a neutral feeling, neither positive or negative,
Right.
then you are ignorant.
Right.
And then it lists a whole sequence. I think you don't understand how they arise, you don't understand how they pass away. And then there was like 3 other ones I didn't quite understand. What is it about neutrality, and how is it linked to ignorance in this particular case?
In this particular case, it's there because there's a level of taking it personally. Even if it's neutral, the mind can still try to possess it as me, mine, or myself. Even if it's not physical possession, it's just like, oh, this is happening to me. And there's a certain level of personalizing going on. But in reality, that underlying tendency to ignorance underlies all 3 qualities of feeling.
Right.
But it's only at the level of neutrality, because it's not painful and it's not pleasant, that there can't be any craving or aversion to it, but there can be still an identification process with it. That identification process itself is the underlying tendency to ignorance.
Okay, and so does the Buddha assume, or Buddhism assume, that identification process in neutrality is happening at a very deep level continuously, or is it much more overt? Like, like it's a conceit, like I walk across the room, it's a fairly neutral experience.
Right.
I'm not thinking I am.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
But there is a sense of being a self separate walking through the room.
Right.
Is that what we're talking about?
That's what we're talking about.
Okay.
But, for the purposes of designation and language, you could say, I am walking across the room.
Right.
But tied to that I am walking across the room, there's no sense of self. The attachment of a personal sense of self to that is the ignorance.
Okay. And then one other question in terms of suffering to faith, and the suffering that catalyzes people to search for a relief. And if it doesn't go to Buddhism, it might not simply go to drugs or alcohol, but could go to some other path.
Sure.
It does seem at times that there's something very exclusionary or exclusive to Buddhism in terms of its alleviation of suffering. And I'm curious about, and obviously there's been all sorts of forms of fundamentalism in Buddhism as well. But is there that exclusivity of the path for Buddhism? Or are there other ways of freedom from suffering?
Okay, so if you think about these first few links, faith, gladness, and even to some extent the joy, this is found in other paths too.
Mhm.
That is to say, the commitment to keep the precepts, like the precepts are universal. If you think about it, it's everywhere in all paths. The idea that you have peace in your mind and intensive loving kindness in your mind, this is not exclusive to Buddhism. The things that are exclusive to Buddhism really primarily is right effort, right mindfulness, and right collectedness, the last three parts of that, and right view. So everything first starts with right view, because the right view is different from, let's say, the other views of the path, which might seem similar, because in the right view, it talks about karma, action and consequence and rebirth and things like that. And there are some paths that talk about it as well. Right intention might also be similar in the sense that there's a cultivation of loving kindness, a cultivation of compassion, and letting go of what is not me, not mine, not myself. The thing about, let's say, Buddhism is that it separates from all other paths when it does not conclude on some absolute notion of self. That is the main distinction between Buddhism and, let's say, other paths.
So no eternal soul, no
Right.
essential self.
Right. It doesn't conclude on that. It doesn't say anything about that.
Right.
But other factors of the path you might find in different places, in different degrees and variations. But then the right view of the Four Noble Truths, that's also very much exclusive to Buddhism. In the sense that when we talk about dukkha, there are very specific dukkhas that the Buddha is talking about. And when you talk about the cessation of that dukkha, there's a specific way in which that's done and how that's done. And that's really the cultivation of the Eightfold Path. No deviation from that. Yeah.
I've heard it said that the Buddha said something like, when he experienced liberation, it was like the entire cosmos was liberated. Is that something that experientially happens?
I guess you'd have to find out what your source is. But at least in the suttas, in the Pali Canon, I've not come across that statement or him describing that kind of experience.
Maybe it's something more Zen.
Yeah, who knows?
But in your experience?
Well, you guys are still here, aren't you?
I actually had the same exact question as you had about other paths, because how would we account then for very highly evolved beings that aren't Buddhist? Like, so for example, you might be familiar with Amma, the hugging saint, right? Who can spend 12 hours without eating or drinking, hugging thousands of people for day after day after day. And so where does she fall in? Like, I know you don't know exactly, but
You know, I'm going to go actually, I might be able to see her when I go to Hawaii next week, so I might ask her.
You gonna ask her?
Yeah.
Have you ever gotten a hug from her before?
Well, if I get to see her, I'll probably hug her.
But I guess my question, just so you know, it's not just a pat; it's a full-on hug. Like it's like.
Oh yeah, I can hug. I can hug.
But she's like this extraordinary, like not even human being, right? And like, so where would she, like, is she ignorant because she doesn't know the Four Noble Truths, or like, which is she going to have to be reborn and and then get fortunate enough to be exposed to the Four Noble Truths? I'm sure she knows some, but you get my point.
Yeah. See, this is why I don't really like to comment on other paths in that way. Because when it comes to Buddhism, it is very specific when it talks about ignorance. In Vedanta, it's very specific about ignorance. In yoga, it's very specific about what ignorance is. In Sankhya, it's very specific about what ignorance is. So from the perspective of, let's say, Buddhism, the idea is that if you know the Four Noble Truths, and it's not just about knowing the Four Noble Truths, by the way, it's also about letting go of complete greed, hatred, and delusion. So if you come across somebody like that, the other part of that to ask is, how well do they understand dependent origination? Again, that's from the perspective of Buddhism. How well are you able to see, understand, and not necessarily explain, but if you had to explain, be able to explain dependent origination? Because again, that's a statement in the Pali Canon. It says, one who knows the Dhamma knows dependent origination. One who sees dependent origination understands the Dhamma.
Let me know what she says.
Yeah, if I see her, I'll let you know.
Yesterday, or a couple days ago, I think you were mentioning how the links of dependent origination are not always explicitly linear, and that in some
Right.
cases there's loops. And is that the case for the transcendental links as well?
Yes, it can be. It can be, because, for example, when you talk about experiencing tranquility, you might experience that at an even later stage, but at a deeper level, right? So it can loop back. And actually, you are consciously, actively looping back. Every time you notice that you don't have enough disenchantment, you loop back to equanimity. Every time you notice you don't have enough equanimity, you loop back to the other. So it's more conscious than rather it being automatic.
I'm also thinking of Nibbana is the unconditioned. And I think you've mentioned in this talk how there's this sequential unfolding, right, of where Nibbana can land. And yet you've also mentioned that it can occur in spontaneous moments outside of meditation even.
Right.
And I'm curious how that fits in.
It fits in because at some point the mind has gone through these processes prior to it.
Okay.
Not necessarily immediately before, but enough to be able to have that experience later on.
Thank you.
There was a question at the back.
And it's just my observation, not a question. And again, I'm a nobody, but at least I think that people have obtained whatever you call it, nirvana, liberation, thousands of years before Buddha, and it'll happen after as well. So there have been, the names may be different, but the experience, I believe, is the same, at least from the descriptions of it. And how somebody relates to it depends on what is relevant for that person, or how applicable it is, or how easily is it explained. Otherwise, you wouldn't have so many religions going back and forth, one dominating the other or whatever. In the olden days, the way they, in the civilized societies, the way they solved it was through debate, not by sword, through debate. Whoever one, they followed the religion of the winner. So the whole countries were actually changed into one or the other. So I think, to me, the end experience is the same. How you reach it is different, and how well it is codified or made it relevant to a common man is probably the difference. And some people, one path might work, for others, it might not work. Otherwise, the whole world would be liberated. That's what I think.
Yeah, I mean, what you said, I would just add to this that even within the context of Buddhism, when we talk about going from wrong view to right view, that's only one step. The final step, in order for you to experience complete liberation, is to go from right view to non-attachment to any views. So trying to figure out which is the right path and the wrong path and all of that is still within the realm of the relative. It's still within the realm of, okay, using the concepts of the Dhamma. See, there's a sutta which is called the simile of the snake. It's Majjhima Nikaya 22. And there the Buddha says there is a right grasping of this practice and there's a wrong grasping. And the wrong grasping is when the mind starts to create identities around the practice itself, starts to create attachments around the practice itself. You need to, if you want to continue with this path, you need to be able to go down this path completely without being attached to it. And that happens at gradual levels until finally he uses the simile of the raft where he says, you take the raft from one shore to the other shore, but you don't carry the raft on you, right? After you get to the other shore to keep walking. You leave the raft wherever it is. So in the most absolute sense, when you come to liberation of the mind, when you come to complete freedom from this cycle of birth and death, then you let go of all concepts altogether. There's no defending one view or the other, but you have come to that point where the mind is free from all of that. In the Sutta Nipata, it talks about how you go from right view and you let go of attachment to right view to where the mind holds no views at all. And that doesn't mean that the mind becomes skeptical. It doesn't mean the mind becomes an irregular. It just means that the mind is, is at rest in the unconditioned. When we talk about the unconditioned, when we talk about Nibbana, the experience of Nibbana, or the way the Buddha has talked about Nibbana, he's used something like 33 different words for Nibbana. One of them is, the uninclined. One of them is the uncreated. Another one is the unformed. The other one is the unconditioned. Another one is the island, the refuge, the shelter, the auspicious, the blessing, and so many different kinds of ways of describing it. Now, to the conceptual mind, the mind that looks at that, it says, that sounds a lot like Brahman. That sounds a lot like the Atma. That sounds a lot like the Self. That sounds a lot like the Tao. That sounds a lot like God. That sounds a lot like this or that. But that's all within the realm of conceptuality. In essence, you have to go beyond conceptuality. And at that point, you don't have to say anything because you've experienced it. And once you've experienced it, that's it. There's no need to try to convince others that you've experienced it. There's no need to try to defend others or debate with others that this is the path and that's the path and all of those things. Because if you do that, then that means there's still some conceit left in you. Only when somebody comes to you and asks you, what is it that you practice or teach or learn or meditate on, then yes, you can go and say, this is what I do and this is what I've learned and this is what I practice. But in the ultimate, absolute sense, when you come to the unconditioned, you have no desire to really try to convince others. You have no desire to try to debate. You have no desire to try to say, this is better than this, or that's better than this. You're content within that experience. And those who want to come on this path will come on this path. And if you're available to show them the way, you show them the way. So religion, spirituality, philosophy, the different words that are used, all of these things lie within the realm of conceptuality. This whole world that we have here is just made up of concepts. And when you hold on to concepts, Majjhima Nikaya 18, the Honeyball Sutta, the Madhupindika Sutta, it says, when you hold on to these conceptual proliferations, that results in attachment and bringing up of the stick and sword, violence. The destruction that we've seen all around the world, the war, the battles, the violence, all of that arises because one person says, I'm right, and the other person says, you're wrong. Or one person tries to convince the other that this is the only way, and so on and so forth. When you come to that point where you are fully awakened, then you don't have to do anything. When the Buddha was fully awakened, he was content in his enlightenment. He was content in being there, sitting under the Bodhi tree, and just relishing in the experience of the unconditioned. Right? He spent 1 week under the Bodhi tree. He spent another week looking at it. He spent another week walking up and down, contemplating dependent origination. He spent another week just looking at the Bodhi tree unblinkingly, and so on and so forth. And he had no inclination to teach it. It was only when the Brahma Sahampati from the pure abodes came down and said, there are those with little dust in their eyes. Perhaps they might benefit from what you have experienced. And so that choice was given to him. And out of compassion, he said, okay, but this is a very difficult and very subtle experience. And not everybody will be able to grasp. And those who will be able to, fine, let's see what happens. And so he set out and taught the first 5 disciples and so on and so forth. And from there, it grew. And that's why you have what are known as Samasama Buddhas, who out of compassion make that choice to go out and teach because they have the faculties and capacities to do so. Not because they have the inclination to do so. I find this statement quite funny in my mind where, the Bahaya Sutta, the one that I often quote, where the Buddha says to Bahaya, so the story is Bahaya, who believes that he is fully awakened. One of his Deva relatives goes to him and says, no, you're not, you need to go see the Buddha. He goes to see the Buddha. The Buddha is going to go for lunch. He's eager to go to lunch. And he says, Bahaya, come back after lunch, right? And I'll tell you. And he says to the Buddha, what if I die? Like, what if I die during lunchtime? Like, if you need to tell me right now, give me the most, bang for my buck. And the Buddha says, okay, fine. And he says that statement, in the seeing, there's only the seen. In the hearing, there's only the heard. In the sensing, there's only the sensed. In the cognizing, there's only the cognized. When Bahaya, there is no you in that, there is no you before that, there is no you after that. Just that is the end of suffering. Bahaya heard those few statements and attained arahatship. And then he died. He was crossing the street and a bull just gored him and he died. So much for mindfulness, huh? No, I'm just joking about that. But But it happened. That was just his mind. He had to die. He died. But then the monks came to the Buddha and said, Baya has passed away. And Buddha says, monks, he passed away as one of you, meaning he became an arahant. And even though he was not formally ordained, the Buddha considered him to be someone ordained under his order. And so he said to give the body the same treatment as you would for one of your fellow brother monks. So they did. And then he also adds something else, which I find humorous. He said, Bhaya monks did not bother me, did not annoy me with unending questions about the Dhamma. Right? Not that he was annoyed, not that he was bothered by it, but what he was pointing to is that there are those who ask questions because their mind is teeming with different kinds of concepts to compare and contrast. Baya's mind was ripe enough to say, just tell me one statement and I'll leave you alone. He was so ready that with that one statement he attained arahantship. Now this is not some kind of offhanded comment to you guys that stop asking questions. No.
Please ask questions during the
But if you just understand this, right, the non-conceptuality, right, it's difficult to understand because that in itself can become a concept. But just keep letting go. This is too is a concept. This too is a concept. This too is a concept. You keep letting go. And what you're left with, so to speak, is the unconditioned. Your mind will naturally drop into the unconditioned. If in every experience that you have, you do not project any kind of concepts to that experience, then your mind is free. Let's share some merit. May suffering ones be suffering free, and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving shed all grief, and may all beings find relief. May all beings share this merit that we have thus acquired for the acquisition of all kinds of happiness. May beings inhabiting space and earth, devas and nagas of mighty power, share this merit of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.